September 1940. A westbound convoy of 34 merchant ships is struggling through a North Atlantic gale 600 miles west of Ireland. The escorts are two corvettes, two ships, each barely 205 feet long, designed 6 months earlier from a whale catcher blueprint, armed with a single gun older than most of their crew. Somewhere beneath that black water, a wolf pack of 5 U-boats is assembling around the convoy perimeter, waiting for nightfall. The corvette crews know what is coming. They have seen convoy after convoy torn apart in these waters. They know their ships are too slow to chase a surfaced U-boat, too small to carry enough depth charges for a prolonged hunt, too lightly armed to fight anything larger than a submarine. They also know that they are the only thing standing between those 34 merchant ships and the bottom of the Atlantic. This is the story of the Flower-class corvette, a warship so cheap, so crude, and so desperately improvised that the men who sailed them called the experience the worst seagoing conditions of any Allied vessel in the war. Churchill reportedly described them as cheap and nasty, cheap for us and nasty for the enemy. The quote is almost certainly apocryphal, but the sentiment was accurate. These were not elegant warships. They were 294 floating depth charge platforms, built from a whale catcher drawing, crewed by bank clerks and farmers, thrown into the most brutal naval campaign in history. And without them, Britain would have starved. The crisis that created the Flower-class corvette was arithmetic. When war broke out in September 1939, the Royal Navy had roughly 180 ships equipped with ASDIC, the underwater detection system needed to find submarines. Of those, 150 were fleet destroyers required for operations with the battle fleet. That left just 24 sloops and 6 coastal patrol vessels for the entire convoy escort mission across the North Atlantic. The escort requirement was staggering. A convoy of 60 merchant ships needed a minimum of 6 escorts. Britain was running dozens of convoys simultaneously. The maths simply did not work, and the U-boats were already hunting. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had calculated that if his submarines could sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, Britain would be unable to replace losses fast enough to survive. In 1940, U-boats sank some 520 ships. After the fall of France handed Germany Atlantic bases at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux, the situation became desperate. October 1940 alone saw 352,407 gross register tons sent to the bottom by U-boats. The Admiralty called it the first happy time. Britain needed escorts, hundreds of them. Destroyers were the obvious answer, but destroyers cost around £500,000 each and required large naval shipyards already at maximum capacity, producing cruisers and capital ships. Destroyer engines demanded steam turbines and geared turbine machinery in critically short supply. Even if the money existed, the industrial capacity to build destroyers fast enough did not. In January 1939, with war looking inevitable after the Munich crisis, the Admiralty approached William Reed at Smith's Dock Company in Middlesbrough with a specific request: design a cheap, simple warship that could be built in the hundreds of small civilian shipyards that had never constructed a naval vessel. Smith's Dock was the obvious choice. They had designed the Z-class whalers in the First World War and were Britain's foremost builders of whale catchers. Reed based his design on a larger version of Smith's Dock's newest whale catcher, Southern Pride, a 700-ton steam-powered vessel built from 1936 to 1938, measuring 160 feet with a top speed of 15.25 knots. The key modifications were straightforward: lengthen the hull by 30 feet for higher speed. Specify 2 marine oil-fired Scotch boilers that could be delivered in around 16 weeks, versus the 7 months or more required for the water tube boilers fitted to destroyers. On the 27th of February 1939, the Admiralty approved Reed's sketch design. The first order of 26 vessels was placed on the 25th of July 1939. 5 weeks before Britain declared war on Germany. Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, was satisfied with the design, but disliked the original designation of patrol vessel, whaler type. He revived the term corvette, a classification the Royal Navy had abolished in 1877, recalling the nimble warships of the Age of Sail. He also insisted that British corvettes be named after flowers, reasoning that news reports of one of Hitler's sea wolves destroyed by a vessel named for a flower carried propaganda value. Canadian corvettes would primarily carry the names of cities and towns. The completed Flower-class corvette displaced 925 tons standard, stretched 205 feet overall, and was propelled by a single 4-cylinder triple-expansion steam engine producing 2,750 indicated horsepower through one propeller shaft. Maximum speed was 16 knots. Range was around 3,500 nautical miles at 12 knots. The original armament consisted of a single 4-inch breech-loading Mark IX gun, a First World War-era weapon, 2 Vickers 50 caliber machine guns, and 40 depth charges on 2 stern rails. Designed crew complement was 85. Wartime reality pushed that to 96. The decisive figure was cost. A Flower-class corvette cost £90,000. A contemporary K-class fleet destroyer cost roughly £500,000, according to the Hansard Parliamentary Record of the 15th of March 1939. For the price of a single destroyer, the Admiralty could commission 5 to 6 corvettes. Corvettes could be built in boatyards, fishing vessel construction works, and general engineering shops that physically lacked the slipway length or crane capacity to construct a destroyer. The machinery patterns for their commercial-type engines already existed. No armor plate was required. The design was deliberately simplified so that yards with no naval experience could build them. Production was extraordinary. By the end of 1939, 110 vessels were under construction. The lead ship, HMS Gladiolus, was laid down in October 1939, launched on the 24th of January 1940, and completed in March 1940, roughly 5 months from keel to commissioning. Average construction time settled at 4 to 6 months across dozens of yards. By war's end, 294 Flower-class corvettes had been built, 145 in British shipyards, around 121 in Canadian shipyards, with additional vessels serving under Free French, Norwegian, Dutch, Greek, Belgian, and other Allied flags. At their peak, Flower-class corvettes represented roughly half of all Allied convoy escort vessels in the North Atlantic. Half, from a whale catcher drawing. The ships were, however, never designed for the role they were forced into. Multiple authoritative sources confirm the Flower class was intended for coastal and inshore patrol, not transatlantic ocean escort. When the desperate reality of the Battle of the Atlantic pushed them into mid-ocean convoy duty, their limitations became painfully apparent. The rounded whale catcher hulls rode on top of the waves rather than cutting through them, producing a violent bobbing and corkscrewing motion that made life aboard unbearable. Rolls of 80 degrees were fairly common. The sailors saying that corvettes would roll on wet grass became one of the most repeated phrases of the war. By 1941, corvettes routinely carried twice as many crewmen as they were designed for. Men slept on lockers, tabletops, or in any dark corner that offered a little warmth. One crew account preserved in the Juneau Beach Center archives described the reality of the mess deck at sea. To reach the entrance, you had to plunge through an almost continual cataract of water. Meals arrived from the galley, when they arrived, always cold and practically swimming. After the first real blow during a crossing, no one in the forecastle had a stitch of dry clothing left. Men just wore their clothes wet until they dried in the wind. There was nothing else they could do. Water 4 inches deep sloshed through the mess deck when level, 14 inches on the roll. The head drained by a straight pipe to the ocean. In rough weather, the North Atlantic flowed in reverse. The crews, predominantly Royal Naval Reserve and Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve personnel, drawn from the merchant navy and civilian life, received 6 pence per day in supplementary hardship pay. Farmers, bank clerks, and teachers pressed into the most punishing sea duty of the war. But the Flower class was phenomenally seaworthy. They survived conditions that damaged or sidelined larger warships. One assessment described a fantastic ability to keep going in weather in which other ships, such as destroyers, were unable to operate. The ship that was too miserable to live in was also too tough to kill. Through wartime refits, corvette armament evolved significantly. Depth charges increased from 40 to 70. Oerlikon 20mm anti-aircraft cannons were added. The single most important upgrade was the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, a forward-throwing weapon that launched 24 contact-fused bombs ahead of the ship, allowing the crew to maintain sonar contact throughout the attack rather than losing it during the final approach. Radar progressed from early sets to the crucial Type 271 centimetric radar, which could detect a surfaced U-boat's conning tower at ranges the Germans could not intercept. Sonar upgraded through successive ASDIC marks. A modified Flower-class design from 1942 stretched the hull to 208 feet, increased displacement to 1,240 tons, and extended the forecastle aft past the bridge for improved seakeeping. The combat record begins with HMCS Chambly and the first U-boat kill by the Royal Canadian Navy. On the 10th of September, 1941, during the catastrophic battle for convoy SC-42, 65 merchant ships were being stalked by Wolfpack Markgraf's 14 U-boats. Commander James Prentice, known as Chummy Prentice, was conducting training exercises aboard HMCS Chambly nearby and received permission to reinforce the escort. Approaching from the dark side of the convoy with the moonlight behind him, Chambly detected U-501 on ASDIC at 700 yards. Within 2 minutes, Prentice released a 5-charge depth charge pattern that sheared off U-501's port rear hydroplane and forced her to the surface. U-501 broke surface directly ahead of the second corvette, HMCS Moose Jaw, commanded by Lieutenant Freddie Grubb. Moose Jaw attempted to ram. In what remains one of the stranger moments of the submarine war, U-501's Captain Hugo Forster abandoned his own command by jumping from the conning tower onto Moose Jaw's deck. His crew scuttled the submarine. It sank, taking stoker William Brown, the sole Canadian casualty, down with it. Prentice received the Distinguished Service Order. The broader SC-42 battle cost 16 merchant ships and 68,259 gross register tons, one of the war's worst convoy losses. But the corvettes had drawn blood. 7 months later, off Haiti, HMCS Oakville attacked U-94 defending Caribbean convoy TAW-15. After depth charging the submarine and ramming it twice, Sub-Lieutenant Hal Lawrence and Petty Officer Art Powell boarded the damaged U-boat. Lawrence's shorts elastic snapped as he landed on the submarine's deck. He fought the boarding action essentially naked, armed with a pistol, grenades, and a flashlight. They shot 2 resisting German sailors, accepted the surrender of others, and Lawrence entered the sinking submarine to search for intelligence documents before escaping as it went down. Lawrence received the Distinguished Service Cross and later featured on a Canadian Men of Valor propaganda poster. He would go on to write A Bloody War, one of the finest corvette memoirs of the conflict. Lawrence. The most extraordinary single-action performance by any corvette came in March 1943. The Free French corvette Akinet was defending convoy HX-228 when the destroyer HMS Harvester rammed U-444 at 27 knots, became entangled, and damaged both propeller shafts. A Connaught closed and also rammed U-444, contributing to its destruction. The following morning, Harvester's remaining shaft broke. Helpless, she was torpedoed by U-432. Commander Tate and 182 of his crew were killed. A corvette returned to the scene, forced U-432 to the surface, and sank her with gunfire and ramming. 2 U-boats destroyed in a single action. On the 21st of April, 1943, General Charles de Gaulle personally boarded a corvette at Greenock and awarded the ship the Croix de la Libération. Over the course of the war, a corvette escorted 116 convoys and spent 728 days at sea. A corvette. If you are finding this deep dive into British naval engineering interesting, consider subscribing. It takes a moment and helps the channel continue producing content like this. Now, back to what happened when the corvettes faced the largest Wolfpack battle of the war. The engagement that proved decisive came in late April and early May 1943. Convoy ONS-5, 42 merchant ships crossing the North Atlantic, was intercepted by over 40 U-boats from Wolfpacks Star and Finke. The Mid-Ocean Escort Force Group B-7 under Captain Peter Gretton consisted of 2 destroyers, 1 frigate, and 4 Flower-class corvettes: Sunflower, Snowflake, Loose Strife, and Pink. For 7 days and nights, B-7 fought a running battle across the Atlantic. Conditions were appalling. Gretton himself was forced to detach in the destroyer Duncan due to a fuel shortage. The corvettes held the line. On the critical night of the 5th to the 6th of May, Sunflower sank U-638. Snowflake and Pink fought off repeated attacks on stragglers, depth-charging contacts, and forced submarines to break off their approach runs. 13 merchant ships were lost, 6 U-boats were sunk, and 7 more were seriously damaged. The official naval historian Captain Stephen Roskill wrote afterward that this 7-day battle, fought against 30 U-boats, is marked only by latitude and longitude, and has no name by which it will be remembered. But it was, in its own way, as decisive as Quiberon Bay or the Nile. Within 3 weeks of ONS-5, Dönitz had lost 41 U-boats in what became known as Black May, 25% of his operational submarine strength. His own son, Peter, was killed aboard U-954. On 24 May 1943, Dönitz ordered the withdrawal of Wolfpacks from the North Atlantic. The corvettes had not won the battle alone, but they had been there, in sufficient numbers, when it mattered. The honest assessment of Flower-class combat performance requires careful framing. Over the course of the war, corvettes participated in sinking approximately 51 enemy submarines. That is a significant number, but destroyers, across all classes and all nations, accounted for a larger total. The most effective anti-submarine ships per vessel were actually the Black Swan-class sloops, which achieved roughly 30 kills from only 37 ships, a rate more than 4 times higher than corvettes. The real significance of the Flower class was not that it outscored other warship types in individual kills. It was that 294 corvettes, comprising half of all convoy escorts in the North Atlantic, made the convoy system possible at the scale required to defeat the tonnage war. Without them, there were simply not enough warships to protect the merchant convoys that kept Britain fed and fighting. The U-boats were ultimately defeated not by the number of submarines sunk by any single ship type, but by the Allied ability to escort 75,000 merchant ships across the Atlantic. The Flower class was the vessel type that made that achievable. The cost was devastating. 36 Flower-class corvettes were lost during the war. 22 were torpedoed by U-boats, 5 were mined, and 4 were sunk by aircraft. Among the most devastating losses, HMS Bluebell was torpedoed by U-711 on 17 February 1945 while escorting convoy RA-64 near Murmansk. An acoustic homing torpedo struck her stern and detonated her own depth charges. She sank in under 30 seconds. Of 86 crew, rescuers heard men crying in the freezing Arctic water, but could not stop for fear of further torpedo attack. 3 unconscious sailors were pulled from the sea. Only 1 could be revived. Petty Officer Albert Holmes of Southampton had previously survived the sinking of HMS Queen Elizabeth and being swept overboard, from HMS Stephenstone. Lieutenant Commander Nicholas Montserrat served as first lieutenant aboard HMS Campanula, a Flower-class corvette, from August 1940 to December 1941 on North Atlantic convoy escort. His semi-autobiographical novel, The Cruel Sea, published in 1951, drew directly from his corvette diaries. He described the fictional corvette Compass Rose as 200 feet long, broad, chunky, and graceless. Designed purely for anti-submarine work, and not much more than a floating platform for depth charges. The novel sold over 1 million copies and remains the finest book written about the war at sea. Today, one Flower-class corvette survives. HMCS Sackville, pennant number K181, was built at St. John Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company, laid down in May 1940 and commissioned in December 1941. Her combat highlight came in August 1942 when she engaged 3 separate U-boats in thick fog while defending a convoy, seriously damaging 2. After the war, she served as an oceanographic research vessel until 1982, then was transferred to the Canadian Naval Memorial Trust. Restored to her 1944 configuration, she is berthed beside the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She was designated a National Historic Site in 1988, and Queen Elizabeth II visited her in 2010. The 2020 Tom Hanks film Greyhound used 3-dimensional scans of Sackville to create its computer-generated corvette model. In 2025, the Royal Navy's Project Cabot Phase 2 explicitly drew inspiration from the Flower-class philosophy. The program envisions uncrewed sensor platforms for persistent surveillance in the same Atlantic waters where corvettes once hunted U-boats, emphasizing the same principles that made the Flower-class decisive: numbers, affordability, and endurance. The lesson endures 80 years later. Return to September 1940. Those 2 corvettes escorting 34 merchant ships through a North Atlantic gale, with 5 U-boats closing in the darkness. The corvette crews had every reason to believe they were inadequate for the job. Their ships were too slow, too small, too lightly armed. They rolled in any sea state. They leaked. They were built from a whale catcher drawing in yards that made fishing boats. But there were enough of them. Night after night, convoy after convoy, from 1940 to 1945, 294 Flower-class corvettes held the line across the Atlantic while better warships were being built. They participated in sinking 51 submarines. They escorted tens of thousands of merchant ships carrying the food, fuel, and weapons that kept Britain in the war. They were crewed by reservists and volunteers who endured the worst living conditions of any Allied sailors afloat. 36 of those ships never came home. The Flower-class corvette was not the fastest warship in the Atlantic. It was not the most heavily armed. It was not the most capable submarine killer. It was the warship that could be built for 90,000 pounds in a boatyard that had never produced a naval vessel in 4 to 6 months by the hundred, using machinery patterns that already existed and engines that any marine workshop could maintain. When Britain needed escorts by the dozen, the corvette was the answer that could actually be delivered. William Reed drew a whale catcher and turned it into the ship that kept the Atlantic convoys alive. That was British engineering. That was the Flower-class corvette.